Hello and welcome to Rules of the Game, where three lawyers demystify the rules nonprofits have to follow when they're advocating on the issues they care about. I'm Tim Mooney.
I'm Leslie Barnes.
And I'm Quinn too. And we're attorneys at Alliance for Justice's Boulder Advocacy Program. Every day we take calls and emails from nonprofits on how to safely and boldly take stances on women's health, climate change, civil rights, and much more.
On this show, we'll talk about some of the greatest hits, questions we get every day. We try to keep the jargon to a minimum, but if you're new to nonprofit advocacy work, check out our starter video at boulderadvocacy.org/start.
On this episode, we're going to chat about a really important topic for folks who work for 501c3s. So many of you who work for C3s do it because you care about the policy and how it's implemented. But for many of you, you also care about who the elected officials are as much as those issues as well. However, as we've talked about on prior episodes of the pod, a C3 that supports or opposes a candidate busts through those metaphorical guardrails that we talked about that are set up by tax law. So, as it turns out, though, those rules only apply to the organization. Folks who work for or volunteer for a 501c3 can, on their own time, in their own individual capacity, support or oppose candidates for public office of their choice. But, as always, the devils are in the details.
That's right. And these rules state that individuals, so paid staff, volunteers, officers, board members, absolutely can volunteer for a campaign, endorse and contribute to candidates on their own time, using their own money, own resources. So they can work for candidates. They can endorse candidates. They can tweet support for candidates or criticism of candidates, but on their own time and resources. So it's really important that if you volunteer or work for or represent in any capacity a 501c3, that you show your separation, that you show that you're working in your own individual capacity when you're supporting or opposing candidates. Quinn, how do you show that separation?
Well, there's a couple of instances where it's really easy to show separation. If you have a work-issued laptop and you have your personal laptop, you could certainly do your work on your work laptop and then your personal activity on your own personal laptop. And same with cell phones, right? But I've often gotten this question as it relates to cell phone, and that is, I have my personal cell phone, but my employer gives me a stipend for use of my cell phone during work hours. So how do I show separation in that instance? And really, the key in showing separation is to understand that the prohibition for a C3 being partisan is absolute. So while you're at work hours, don't use your cell phone for political purposes or anything that can be seen as supporting or opposing a candidate is probably a better way to state it as opposed to political. Don't do anything like forward a campaign email or take a call about a fundraising event at 10 a.m. when you're supposed to be working. But absolutely feel free to do the same activity at 10 p.m. when hopefully you're not working at that point, right? Not everything that you do in an 8-hour workday is going to be non-exempt, and the IRS recognizes that life happens. But this is also an area where there's no clear guidance or rules from the IRS. So the cell phone usage is really an analogy that I've drawn from the private world, the private business world that I came from. So in that private business world, everybody knows that you can write off business mileage. It would be the same thought process here in terms of your cell phone usage. If your employer is providing a stipend for it, then you can certainly allocate that time for work purposes, but off work hours, then it becomes personal usage again.
I love that you drew that analogy there, Quinn, because as you are well aware, we're all well aware, that's what we have to do for so much of these tax exempt rules, because a lot of them, well, let's start off with the first thing. We kind of make fun of the IRS. We kid because we care. They don't give us a ton of guidance on this stuff, as you've said. But what little guidance that we have been given, well, frankly, it's pretty old. It's often from the 70s and 80s. So we're constantly trying to draw analogies from other areas of IRS guidance for exempt organizations to be able to give good advice on this kind of stuff. The key thing here is, remember the deal that we talked about. The reason why C3s get this a great tax exempt treatment is because of those restrictions on their advocacy work, right? So the key thing here is that C3 money that flows through a 501c3 that has been given a tax deduction to somebody somewhere along the line, that money isn't subsidizing personal partisan work. It cannot happen. The restrictions flow with that money. So the same thing is true when you're working as an individual. You got to show that separation so that there isn't any subsidization of that. So this is easy at times, as Quinn has talked about. It's also hard at times, as Quinn has talked about. Let's say, for instance, that I've got a friend. I know, that's Tim's got a friend. But let's say that I've got a friend that is running for the DC Council, and I want to be able to support that person's run. But I work at Alliance for Justice, a 501c3. There's got to be a way for me to figure out how to do that. Leslie, I know that you've got some experience in this area. What kind of advice would you give me?
You're right. I've got just a little bit of experience. So for a number of years, I walked this line every day. My husband was a state representative for Indiana, and I worked for the state government of Indiana. And while state government isn't exactly the same as a C3, state governments also have to remain nonpartisan. So in this area, it was identical as if I had worked for C3. And so what I did is during the day when I worked for the state, I focused on and gave the state my time, and I only engaged in nonpartisan activity. Then at night, then John and I would work on his campaign. We would attend fundraising events. We would post on social media about the campaign. We would engage in partisan political activity. But as Quinn said, life happens. Somebody calls you during the day. And so what I would do is I would step out. I would go off the clock and take that phone call, if need be, on my personal cell phone. But there are lots of other ways to show separation, and so it was really important because I was well known, not super well known, but because I traveled all over the state and gave trainings for the state of Indiana. When I appeared in my capacity as a representative of my husband's campaign and my my partisan capacity, I would wear name tags. So if I was representing the state of Indiana, I would wear a name tag saying Indiana Election Division, Leslie Barnes. Or if I was, representing the campaign, I would try to show that delineation that I was there in my personal capacity. Same as at work. If my employer had a policy, so if we needed to use the photocopier, for our child's play, make a photocopier of the play so I could send it to my mom. They had a policy that if we used the photocopier for personal purposes for more than 10 copies a month, we would reimburse the state for those personal copies. And so as Tim said, it is showing that the C3 is not subsidizing the partisan work. And that was one way that our state government did that. Let's see. So Tim, are there other ways that you can show that separation on social media?
Yeah, and in fact, on social media, it's actually pretty important that you do that at times. I talked about it before. Actually, Quinn brought it up. Sometimes it's super easy to show that distinction just by using different things. So let me use an example that I've got. I've got 2 Twitter accounts. I'm at AFJ Tim for all things related to this podcast. Anything that is work related all goes through that. So I talk about election related things, election administration, voting rights, all things that are all part of 501c3 approvable things that I work on in my daily work. Then I have what I like to call my jokes and garbage account. And no, you can find me probably if you'd like. But there, I'm a little more free to talk about other things that are, frankly, non-exempt purpose activities. Syracuse University basketball when they play, Buffalo Bills football, and all sorts of things having to do with the sports ball that I'm interested in. But also from time to time, when I show support or opposition to candidates that I care about. And that can all go in that particular place, but not in the @AFJ Tim thing. So having that separation there can be really, really helpful there. Sometimes, though, there are social media accounts that you don't really have multiple versions of. Facebook is a great example. Now, I'm not super active on Facebook anymore, but to the extent that I ever was, I was able to put in the disclaimer the difference between the two of them. I could mention, when I say the two of them, my work-related stuff and my non-work-related stuff. So you could put in a disclaimer that says, hey, look, when I'm talking about work-related stuff, I'll make sure I say it. Or these communications are all my personal opinion, not having to do with my work. Yeah, I'll identify that I work for Alliance for Justice, but here on this platform, I'm not saying anything that should be taken as work that I'm doing on behalf of the organization, and I'm not going to be using work time on this particular platform. Lots of different possibilities for you to show that kind of real separation there. We often joke, we have pictures of it in the show notes, as Quinn will definitely talk about later. We have pictures of different hats, because you wear different hats in different areas of your life. A personal hat, a 501c3 hat. The three of us also occasionally wear a 501c4 hat for Alliance for Justice Action Campaign. On social media, you want to really make sure you know what hat you're wearing when.
Every day we get calls from organizations and employees that work for C3s that want to know how they can kind of create this separation. They understand that when they're working for a C3, they can't show support or opposition for a candidate, but they also know that they want to exercise that right in their own individual capacity. And I got a call from a C3 employee that wanted to attend the Democratic National Convention, and her C3 employer was understandably hesitant that if this employee attended the DNC, that it might appear that the C3 organization itself was supporting or opposing the Democratic Party and its slate of candidates, which would be impermissible for a C3 to do. And so we talked through whether or not the employer had a policy for employees engaging in partisan activity, and minus the employer having such a policy, employees do maintain that right to engage in partisan political activity. If employers are interested in adopting kind of this, broad policy that allows their employees to engage in partisan activity, but kind of sets the guardrails so that the employees' activities are not then attributed to the organization. We've got some sample policies on our website. Feel free to download and modify them. But yeah, we talked about how this employee could go to the Democratic National Convention, but be very clear that they were there in their own individual capacity.
So, as you probably can tell on this episode, there's a couple of key points. One, act in good faith. Don't get cute about these policies. So basically, know what hat you're wearing. You can absolutely do political things on your own time. But when you do, be clear that it's you and not the organization.
We've got a series of resources on this important topic. The first, for your board members. It's a fact sheet called Board Members and Election Year Activities. The second, a little bit broader for everyone that works for a 501c3, called Election Activities for Individuals Associated with 501c3s. And last but not least, an important little document there, it's a sample 501c3 organizational policy for election season that can be helpful for creating the guardrails and creating some more clear areas of guidance where the IRS really doesn't give it.
We hope this episode helps make you a bolder advocate. Join us next time for more ways to maximize your advocacy and make positive change in your community.
We're much more than this podcast. If you've got questions, you can call Boulder Advocacy at 866-NP-LOBBY or email us at advocacy@afj.org. You might even get one of us. If you found the show helpful, please rate us on whatever app you're listening so others can find us.
For more resources mentioned on this show, plus the show notes for this podcast, visit boulderadvocacy.org. On behalf of Leslie and Tim, this is Quinn. Thanks for joining.